The snow was still falling when they placed the cuffs on a 13-year-old boy whose only crime was trying to save a cat. In the flicker of firelight, justice turned its back and a child was left alone. His only friend, a loyal German shepherd who vanished the moment the sirens wailed. But what if the truth was never buried, just waiting to be found? Stay with us, because what comes next may just mend the part of your heart that stopped believing in love, loyalty, and the chance to begin again. The morning sky over Detroit's west side was a dull slate gray, the kind that pressed against rooftops and made the air feel heavier than it should. Early autumn brought no warmth, only a biting wind that skated across cracked sidewalks and rattled the skeletal branches of sycamore trees. Smoke still lingered faintly in the cold, hinting at the fire that had devoured the home on Parnell Street 3 nights before. What once stood as a stately brownstone was now a blackened carcass behind yellow police tape. Caleb Morgan stood on the curb in an oversized hoodie, the sleeves swallowed his wrists. He was 13, slight of frame, with high cheekbones and wide brown eyes that carried a depth unusual for his age. His skin was the color of warm mahogany, though the chill had drained it of warmth. His hair, tightly coiled, was hidden beneath a beanie that had seen better days. Caleb was the kind of kid who rarely raised his voice, the one teachers said had potential, though they often failed to understand his silences. He didn't talk much, especially not after his mother died 2 years earlier from a late-diagnosed illness. Since then, he had lived with his great-aunt Della in a faded duplex with peeling paint and a squeaky screen door. Caleb had only one real companion. Ranger, a German shepherd with intelligent blue eyes and a protective nature. Ranger was 3 years old, powerful and sleek, with a sable coat and a faint scar above one paw from when Caleb found him tangled in the barbed wire behind the grocery outlet. Since that day, Ranger had not let Caleb out of his sight. The dog had a quiet watchfulness about him, rarely barking unless he sensed something truly amiss. That morning, however, Caleb was without him. He stood alone, his eyes locked on the ashes of a house where something terrible had happened, and where, according to the authorities, something unforgivable had been done by him. Detective Roland Sparks was the first to arrive. A tall, broad man in his 50s with thinning blonde hair and a gut shaped by too many late-night burgers. Sparks had a voice like gravel and eyes that always seemed to doubt the world. He had a habit of chewing the cap of his pen, a nervous tick that had survived years on the force. Sparks didn't believe in gut feelings, but he had a long history of quick conclusions, and Caleb, standing quietly at the scene with a soot-smudged cheek and a box of matches in his hoodie pocket, was all the proof Sparks needed. Beside him was Officer Sarah Meeks, a woman in her late 30s, lean and wiry, with sharp features and a short ponytail the color of rust. Sarah had joined the department after surviving a mugging in her 20s, an event that left her both guarded and uncompromising. She had a reputation for being fair but blunt, especially with kids. She didn't speak much when she first saw Caleb, just scanned him with a mixture of suspicion and pity. The fire had killed one man, Ronald Gable, a local real estate developer, known more for his litigation than his charity. His body had been found in the back hallway, the walls around him charred and blistered. Witnesses said they had seen a small figure near the back of the house around the time the fire broke out, and Caleb, who'd gone inside, trying to save a stray cat he often fed, became the figure in question. No one listened when he said he had seen someone else, an adult figure, fleeing through the alley. No one believed that the matches were from an old art project, and no one mentioned the cat, which had vanished into the night, leaving only soot-smeared paw prints on Caleb's arms. 2 hours later, Caleb was in the back of a police car. Ranger, barking and clawing at the fence, had to be restrained by an animal control officer named Mason Hale, a gentle older man who had no choice but to take the dog. Mason was short and stocky, with a gray beard and eyes that always looked sad even when he smiled. He didn't like what he saw in the boy's eyes that day, too much confusion and too little justice. "You take care of this one," he whispered to Ranger before closing the van's gate. Caleb said nothing when questioned, not because he had no answers, but because he knew they wouldn't matter. He remembered the way Sparks leaned over the table, voice low and patronizing. "This is your chance to be honest, kid. We know it was you. Just tell us why." Caleb stared at the floor. He remembered the smoke, the scream, the sound of a window shattering, but none of those things made sense with the version they wanted to write. The public defender they assigned him was a woman named Evelyn Tran, fresh out of law school and clearly overwhelmed. She had kind eyes and a nervous smile, but couldn't fight the momentum already crashing down. In the hearings that followed, no one mentioned Caleb's clean record, his reputation at school, or the way he always stayed behind to help Mr. Patel lock up the corner store. Instead, they pointed to motive his frustration with losing his mother, the hardship of his living situation, the presence of matches. No one mentioned Ranger. Within a week, the judge signed the order. Caleb was to be sent to Ridgeway Juvenile Correctional Center until further psychological evaluation. They didn't let him say goodbye. 2 years had crawled by since Caleb Morgan first entered Ridgeway Juvenile Correctional Center, a weather-stained facility tucked between a stretch of pine trees and an abandoned railroad in northern Michigan. The building with its faded beige bricks and cold steel doors looked less like a place for rehabilitation and more like a forgotten monument to punishment. The seasons changed, the snow melted and returned again, but inside the walls time seemed trapped in molasses thick heavy and nearly impossible to move through. Caleb had grown taller, his shoulders had broadened, his voice had deepened, and a faint scar now marked the bridge of his nose, a souvenir from a scuffle in the cafeteria during his first winter inside. He had learned to keep his head down, to read quietly in the corners, and to answer questions with short, measured words. But one thing hadn't changed his silence about the night of the fire, not because he was hiding the truth, but because no one had ever truly asked to hear it. He never cried, not when he was denied visits from relatives, not even when other boys whispered cruel things in the dark. But once a month, usually late at night, when the guards were doing rounds and the dormitory was quiet, he let the tears slip when he thought of Ranger, his only real friend, the dog he never got to say goodbye to. In those moments, he would close his eyes and remember the warmth of Ranger's fur, the way his tail thumped against the kitchen floor, and how he always pressed his muzzle into Caleb's side when he sensed the boy was sad. Warden Jessica Bell was a tall woman with angular shoulders and the kind of posture that suggested she'd never leaned on anything in her life. Her hair, once auburn, was streaked with silver and always pulled into a taut bun that seemed to hold her entire identity in place. She had been in charge of Ridgeway for nearly a decade and ran it with a quiet, relentless efficiency. Her reputation was built on structure, protocol, and a belief that emotional softness led to weak governance. But she wasn't cruel. She was simply conditioned like steel, forged by bureaucracy. A single mother who had raised 2 sons while working night shifts at a juvenile center in Grand Rapids, Bell, had learned early on that detachment was armor. One gray Wednesday, she found Caleb sitting alone on a bench during outdoor rec time, not playing basketball or talking with the others, but sketching with a pencil stub and a scrap of cafeteria napkin. She paused. The drawing was of a German shepherd, mid-run tongue, lolling out ears perked. The detail was uncanny. "That your dog?" she asked, arms folded across her chest. Caleb nodded. "His name's Ranger. He's still alive." "As far as I know," Caleb replied softly. "He was with animal control the last I heard." Warden Bell studied the boy for a moment. "Most kids in here draw guns, flames, skulls. You draw a dog." Caleb said nothing, eyes on the paper. Later that week, he submitted a formal request. One sentence written in careful block letters. "Before I turn 15, I'd like to see Ranger one more time." When Bell received it, she read it 3 times, then placed it under a stack of reports on her desk. Officially, animals weren't allowed on prison grounds unless for therapy programs. Caleb's wasn't. There were rules. And Bell lived by rules. But the request stayed on her mind. Hundreds of miles south in a small, weather-beaten apartment above a violin repair shop in Ann Arbor, Amelia Harper was grading a pile of music theory quizzes when she received a call from an unfamiliar number. She was in her early 40s with honey brown skin and soft eyes that seemed permanently rimmed with sleepless empathy. Amelia had been Caleb's music teacher in middle school, a woman who still kept a framed photo of her class recital from 4 years ago. Caleb had played triangle, poorly, but he had shown up early, asked questions, and smiled when she offered him a second part in the percussion ensemble. She had followed his case from afar, dismayed by how quickly the community had turned on him. Over time, most people had moved on. Amelia hadn't. The call came from a retired librarian named Dale Truitt, who once volunteered at the animal shelter, where Ranger had been temporarily placed. "I just wanted to let you know," Ma'am Dale rasped over the phone, "that dog, he's still around. Ended up with a friend of mine who lives out in Flat Rock, the boy's dog, Caleb's." Amelia pressed the phone tighter. "He's alive. Old now, graying muzzle. Hips don't move like they used to, but he still perks up when you say the boy's name." That night, Amelia didn't sleep. She found herself looking at the old recital photo and whispering Caleb's name like it might carry through the walls to wherever he was. The next day, she wrote a letter not to Caleb, who wasn't allowed mail from unaffiliated individuals, but to Warden Bell. It was short, respectful, and signed with her full credentials as an educator. She requested a visit, not for herself, but for a dog. If there is still any mercy in your system, she wrote, please grant him the chance to see the one soul who never turned on him. Belle read the letter 3 times. She had once watched her youngest son weep for a week when their family dog was euthanized. She remembered that helplessness, but policy was policy. Still that night, she found herself walking to the administrative records room and pulling Caleb's file again, reading his intake notes. No behavioral issues, no disciplinary flags. One staff member had even noted kids quiet, reads a lot, doesn't cause trouble. 2 days later, she made a call to Flat Rock. When she met Amelia Harper in person a week later, it was under the clinical lighting of Ridgway's side office. Amelia had brought medical clearance papers for Ranger, now clearly aging graying muzzle, cloudy eyes, but still upright and alert. His tail had wagged the moment he entered the room. Warden Bell folded her hands. I'm bending a rule, not breaking it. 1 supervised visit, 30 minutes, and only because the dog's paperwork is clean. You understand. Amelia nodded. Thank you, Warden, truly. Belle stood, smoothed her blazer, and added quietly, he still draws him, you know. The dog. Every chance he gets. Outside, snow had begun to fall lightly across the yard, and for the first time in 2 years, something warm moved behind the gray walls of Ridgway. The town of Flat Rock, Michigan sat under a low-hanging ceiling of winter clouds as Sean Holloway sipped lukewarm coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. The retired detective, now 62, had grown accustomed to the quiet routine of his post-career life, early morning walks, crime novels, and helping out at the local library's community safety program. But something had shifted the night before a conversation overheard at a gas station on Telegraph Road. A teenager behind the counter had mentioned a kid upstate locked away for a fire he might not have started. Just a stray dog, that's what he went in for. Just to save a dog or something, and now he's locked for good. The words echoed in Holloway's ears all night. It wasn't the first time he'd heard of a case where truth took a backseat to closure. He'd seen too many of those cases hurried through the system, scapegoats found before questions could be fully asked. Holloway wasn't built like most men his age. He had the kind of frame that once filled out a leather jacket, though it had softened with time. His face bore the wrinkles of too many years under fluorescent interrogation lights, and his right hand trembled slightly from an old injury sustained during a raid in Lansing. He wasn't bitter, just haunted. By noon the next day, he was inside the Flat Rock Community Records office requesting access to public trial documents. The clerk, a college-age woman with lavender-dyed hair and an eyebrow piercing, raised a brow when he asked for Caleb Morgan's case file. You serious, she said, popping gum. That thing's like 2 years old. Nobody talks about it anymore. I do, Holloway said, voice gravelly. Print it all. 3 hours later, his kitchen table was covered in pages, the arrest report, court transcripts, witness statements, forensic summaries. And something didn't sit right. The initial arresting officer, Detective Roland Sparks, had cited a matchbox found in Caleb's pocket, soot on his sleeves, and one vague witness account, a neighbor named Ms. Linda Trask, who claimed she saw a small shadow near the house before it burned. Linda Trask. Holloway remembered her from a different case 5 years ago, known in the system for being eager to testify and easily influenced. That file had been red-flagged for unreliable testimony. That was the first crack. The next morning, Holloway made the drive to Detroit. He parked outside the charred remains of the brownstone on Parnell Street. Snow had dusted the roofless walls like powdered sugar on burnt toast. A neighbor watched him from a porch across the street, a man in his 70s with leathery skin and nicotine-stained fingers. His name was Curtis DeWitt, a retired postman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 4 decades. You're looking at the wrong side of the house, Curtis rasped as Holloway approached. Fire didn't start in the front. That door was wide open when the flames started. Smoke came from the alley. Alley, Holloway asked, intrigued. Curtis nodded, lighting a cigarette with gnarled hands. Back door was busted in. I saw it. Told the first cops too, but they brushed me off. Said they had their guy. Did you see who went in? Too dark, just movement. But that kid Caleb, he was crying when they pulled him out. Holding a cat like it was the last thing left in the world. That was enough for Holloway. He drove to the Detroit Police Department archive office under the guise of collecting data for a criminal justice workshop he was allegedly hosting. Inside the record vault, he located the fire scene photos. And there it was, a blurry frame from the alley camera across the street. The timestamp matched the night of the fire. A shadowy figure was visible exiting the rear of the house, taller than Caleb by at least a head. He requested a copy and left, ignoring the suspicion of the junior archivist. Back in Flat Rock, Holloway called an old friend, Nina Patel, a forensic analyst who had worked with him on dozens of cases during his active years. Nina was in her mid-40s, sharp as broken glass, with jet black hair always tied back in a braid and a pair of gold-rimmed glasses that magnified her piercing eyes. She now ran a small private consulting firm, but had never stopped believing in the work of justice. "I need help," Holloway said as she opened her apartment door. "I've got a file, a kid's life on the line. I think we missed something big." "Bring it in," she replied, already clearing space on her kitchen table. They spent hours cross-referencing evidence. Nina caught a detail in the forensic summary. Soot patterns on Caleb's clothing suggested exposure to smoke, but not ignition. "He came in after the fire started," she concluded. "His clothes have upper thorax smoke stains, but no heat warping or flammable residues. He wasn't near the origin point. He was entering, not starting." "What about footprints?" Holloway asked. Nina flipped through the last page of the scene report. Only one set was documented in the rear hall. Boot prints, size 10.5. Caleb's intake size was 7.5. She paused. "You realize none of this made it into trial. Buried or ignored," Holloway muttered, jaw tight. By midnight, Holloway drafted a report with Nina's help. They had enough to reopen the investigation, but he knew better than to go through the front door. The system would close ranks if threatened. He needed a wild card, and he knew exactly who. The snow had fallen heavy overnight, blanketing the grounds of Ridgeway Juvenile Correctional Center in a thick white hush. It was early morning, 6:45 a.m., and everything felt strangely still. Inside the East Wing, fluorescent lights buzzed to life in long, humming rows. Caleb Morgan was already awake. He sat on the edge of his narrow bunk, tying the frayed laces of his sneakers with fingers that trembled more than he liked to admit. The anticipation was a knot in his chest, tight, painful, hopeful. He didn't know why the guards had woken him an hour early. They only told him to get dressed and wait. That alone was unusual. Routine was religion inside Ridgeway. Caleb had changed in the last 2 years. Now, 15, he had gained muscle in his arms and jawline, but the softness in his gaze had never fully vanished. His eyes still carried the quiet storm of someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast. Most days he wore a kind of practiced numbness, a survival mask, indifferent and blank. But not today. Down the corridor, Warden Jessica Bell walked with her usual crisp steps, clipboard in hand, her expression unreadable. She wore her standard navy slacks, blazer, and low-heeled boots, but her movements this morning were more deliberate. Accompanying her was Officer Dennis Harrow, a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with thinning red hair and a thick Midwestern accent. Harrow had a gruff appearance with a square jaw and crow's feet etched deep from years of field work, but his demeanor toward the youth was unexpectedly gentle. He had served in corrections for nearly 2 decades and had long believed in second chances, though he'd seen fewer of them granted than he'd have liked. Waiting at the staff entrance was Amelia Harper, bundled in a long wool coat, cheeks pink from the cold. Her gloved hand held a leash, and at the end of it stood Ranger. The German shepherd was slower now, his once sharp movements softened by age. Flecks of white grayed his muzzle, and his eyes, though still sharp, carried the gentle glaze of a dog that had seen too many winters. Yet, when the leash tightened and he spotted the building, his ears perked high and his tail lifted in alert recognition. "He's been waiting for this," Amelia whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Officer Harrow approached. "You sure he won't panic inside?" "Only if he doesn't find who he's looking for," Amelia replied. Bell nodded. "Let's proceed. He has 15 minutes. They led Ranger through the narrow halls. The dog moved with cautious, eager steps, his claws clicking against the linoleum floor. The scent of sterilized bleach mixed with the sharp tang of old metal bars. Ranger sniffed the air nose, twitching, body tensing. He paused at one corner, turned sharply left, and pulled ahead with more strength than his age should have allowed. Caleb sat in a small visitation room with concrete walls and a single observation window. No one had told him what was happening, only that a visitor had arrived. His leg bounced with nerves as he heard footsteps approaching then. Claws. The door creaked open. At first, the room was just doorway and light. Then a bark, a single sharp, heart-piercing bark. And then came Ranger. The German shepherd barreled through the door, letting out a series of excited yelps, half cry, half celebration. He bounded across the room toward Caleb, who froze in disbelief. The room dissolved into a blur of fur sound and warmth. Ranger Caleb choked his voice, breaking in mid-word. Ranger leapt onto him gently, clumsily, pressing his head against Caleb's chest and wagging his tail so hard his entire body shook. Caleb buried his face into the dog's fur, his arms tightening around Ranger's neck. He hadn't cried in years, not really, but now the tears came hot and sudden, spilling down his cheeks like they'd been waiting all this time. Outside the viewing window, Warden Bell watched silently. Her face remained composed, but one hand tightened on the edge of her clipboard. Inside the room, Caleb whispered, "I thought I lost you, boy. I thought they took you forever." Ranger let out a soft whine and licked the boy's cheek. Amelia stepped in for just a moment, tears in her own eyes. She stood back and let the scene breathe, not daring to interrupt. Caleb glanced up at her and gave a barely perceptible nod. It was all the thanks he could manage. Officer Harrow cleared his throat from the doorway, not rushing, just reminding. 12 minutes, he said softly. Caleb didn't move. He just kept one hand on Ranger's chest, feeling the heartbeat thudding there, like a familiar drum like home. Ranger's tail never stopped moving. In those few stolen moments, the sterile world of Ridgeway dissolved. No bars, no uniforms, no sentence. Just a boy and his dog reunited across the divide of injustice. When the time came, Ranger resisted being led away. He looked back, whined, and tried to stay pressed against Caleb's leg. Caleb leaned forward and kissed the dog's head. "I'll see you again," he promised. "You hold on." Amelia crouched beside Ranger, her voice soothing. "We'll be waiting, both of us." Ranger reluctantly followed her out, his ears pinned tail down. Caleb watched until the door closed, until the sound of claws faded. He sat alone again, but not empty. For the first time since his arrest, the pain of solitude had a crack of light running through it. Snow continued to pile in soft ridges along the sidewalks of Flat Rock, as Sean Holloway parked his dusty silver sedan behind a faded brick deli on Crane Street. Inside the car, he thumbed through a file labeled Concannon Mark J, a name that had resurfaced twice over the past 48 hours. First in the fire inspector's interview notes from the original investigation, then again in an old utilities bill Amelia Harper had recovered from a city records dump. Mark J. Concannon had once been listed as a subcontractor for Ronald Gable, the man who perished in the fire that condemned Caleb Morgan. Sean adjusted his coat collar and stepped into the deli's warmth. The bells over the door jingled, and a swirl of cold air followed him in. Behind the counter stood a man with greased-back black hair, tan skin, and a faded tattoo peeking from beneath the sleeve of his white apron. He was in his late 30s, thick-set but solid, with a scar above his right eyebrow that looked like a knife wound healed over decades. This was Felix Dominguez, deli owner, and a man who had once been arrested for illegal gambling, but later cleared. More importantly, he had once been roommates with Concannon in a rundown duplex on 12th and Hardy. Sean had done his homework. "Coffee?" Felix asked, voice neutral. "I'm not here for lunch," Sean replied. "I'm looking for Mark Concannon. Heard he used to live with you." Felix leaned forward slowly. "He still owes me 2 months' rent. Haven't seen him since the night Gable's place burned down. Cops never asked. Guess they didn't care." Sean's eyes sharpened. "That's the night I'm interested in, too." Felix hesitated, then shrugged. "Mark came in that night past midnight smelling like smoke. I thought he'd set the stove on fire again. Didn't say a word, just grabbed some stuff and left." "Did he say where he was going?" Felix shook his head. "Nope. But he had a burner phone, kept it on him all the time. One of those flip phones, real old school. Always paranoid someone was listening." Sean nodded. "You still got any of his things?" Felix didn't answer immediately. Then he jerked his chin toward the back. "If you're digging through ghosts, be my guest." In a cardboard box under a rusted water heater, Sean found what he hadn't dared to hope for: an old invoice book marked with both Concannon's name and Ronald Gable's in faded ink, as well as 3 burner phone receipts, all dated within the month leading to the fire. That evening, Sean met Amelia at her apartment. She was still wearing her coat when he laid the evidence out on her coffee table, breathing heavily as the pieces fell into place. "This links him financially to Gable," Sean said, And if this receipt means what I think it means, Gable was paying him under the table for something shady. Maybe hush money, maybe something worse. Amelia narrowed her eyes, tapping the invoice. Concannon was on probation 3 years ago. Aggravated assault. He shouldn't have even been near construction work. They pulled up the building permit history on Amelia's laptop. One name popped up repeatedly as Inspector of Record Leonard Jensen, a retired city official with a record of overlooking violations in exchange for donations to his brother's campaign. Jensen was never charged, but the whispers had been enough to stain his reputation. Amelia leaned back in her chair. This is starting to feel like something bigger than one fire. The next morning, Amelia paid a visit to a security firm downtown, where a friend of hers, Shannon Lefferts, worked as an account analyst. Shannon, in her early 30s, had a pale complexion and wore thick glasses. She moved with a nervous energy, constantly tucking her hair behind her ears. Brilliant in digital forensics, Shannon had helped Amelia before on student data leaks. "I'm looking for any private camera footage from the area around Parnell Street 2 years ago," Amelia asked, "especially from a gas station or convenience store facing the alley behind the brownstone." Shannon clicked away at her keyboard. "Most of that footage is wiped every 30 days, but sometimes companies back up clips if something major happens." 10 minutes later, she smiled. Bingo. Midtown Fuel had a system that auto-saved footage marked incident-related. They still have data logs from the night of the fire. She turned the monitor. There, grainy but distinct, was a figure walking briskly down the alley. It was 12:12 a.m., minutes before emergency calls were made. The man's hood was up, but a partial face was visible in one frame, enough for Amelia to recognize the jagged profile from Concannon's arrest photo. Her stomach twisted. "We need to take this to someone official, someone who'll listen." Sean nodded. "There's one more place to go." They visited a modest office in the administrative building of the district attorney's office. There, behind a desk stacked with files and a motivational poster that read, "Justice is relentless," sat Brian Kerr. Kerr was a deputy district attorney in his early 40s, tall and impeccably dressed, with the permanent frown of someone who carried more moral weight than his paycheck allowed. His voice was calm, precise, and unyielding. He had once dismissed Caleb's appeal, but only because the evidence then was lacking. Sean slid the footage across the desk, along with the burner phone receipts and the financial links. This was ignored. Concannon had both motive and opportunity. The kid never should have been in the frame. Kerr studied it silently for minutes that stretched like hours. Finally, he looked up. "I'll issue a formal request to reopen the investigation." Quietly. Amelia leaned forward. "Can you stop the process before it escalates again?" Kerr nodded. "If this is real, and it certainly appears to be, I'll see that it reaches the right ears. But it won't be easy." Outside, Sean exhaled into the cold. "We're getting close." "Too close," Amelia murmured, looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow. If this was a cover-up, someone out there still wants it buried. But neither of them would stop now. Snow continued to fall in lazy spirals over Ridgeway Juvenile Correctional Center, blanketing the grounds in deceptive calm. Inside, tension crackled like static between concrete walls and flickering fluorescent lights. Warden Marion Bell stood at her office window, arms folded over her chest, watching the snow settle atop the fencing coils. At 58, she was a woman of formidable presence with silver-streaked black hair pinned into a tight bun and sharp hazel eyes that rarely betrayed emotion. Her tall, commanding figure and crisp Navy uniform lent her the air of a general more than a prison administrator. Over 2 decades in the correctional system had taught her restraint, but something about the boy Caleb Morgan gnawed at her certainties. On the desk behind her sat a slim brown envelope delivered earlier that morning by a courier from the district attorney's office. Inside were printed stills from security footage copies of burner phone receipts and a note signed by Deputy DA Brian Kerr. Recommend temporary suspension of adult trial proceedings. Ongoing investigation pending. Belle turned away from the window. Her conscience stirred slow and reluctant. She had long believed in rules chains that held the world together, but for once she loosened one. She picked up the phone, delay Caleb Morgan's transfer, indefinitely. 2 blocks across the city in a modest suite atop the county municipal building, Amelia Harper waited with a thrum of nerves pulsing behind her sternum. She wore a deep green sweater and a scarf that failed to hide the lines of worry etched along her jaw. Sean Holloway stood beside her, one hand resting on a manila folder, thick with every scrap of evidence they had gathered. Before them sat a man in his early 30s, clean-shaven and lean, his blue tie slightly crooked and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. This was Assistant Prosecutor Brian Moore. Moore had a reputation for fierce ambition, tempered by uncommon integrity, a rarity in a world where ambition often eclipsed truth. With sandy hair, a narrow nose, and an intense youthful gaze, he looked more like a graduate student than a lawyer. He had joined the DA's office 3 years earlier, quickly climbing ranks with a string of convictions. But this case, Caleb's case, was the first time doubt had crept into his mind, like cold water through a cracked windshield. Sean spoke first. "You've seen the camera footage. You've read the witness statement about the door being forced from the outside. You've seen the financial ties between Gable and Concannon. How can you stand by the original charge?" Moore sighed and leaned forward, fingers laced. "I wasn't the one who filed it, but I've reviewed the file, and now I'm seeing a case that was decided too quickly. A scared kid, a missing cat, a burned house. No motive, just a matchbox and a city in a hurry to move on." Amelia's voice tightened. "If this goes to adult court, Caleb won't survive it. He's a child who made no mistake. All he wanted was to save something small, something soft." Moore nodded slowly. "I've requested an emergency hearing. We'll present the new evidence to a juvenile court judge. If we succeed, the motion to try him as an adult will be dismissed." But Sean asked. "But the hearing is in 3 days," Moore said. "And the original prosecutor, Marcus Hines, still holds sway in that courtroom. He's not going to let this go quietly." Marcus Hines was a man who needed no introduction. A veteran of over 30 years, his neatly pressed suits and booming voice had convicted dozens of minors under adult statutes. With his square jaw, silver mustache, and penchant for theatrics, he carried the air of a crusader. But his brand of justice was rigid, his belief in guilt rarely shaken, and he did not appreciate interference. "He'll try to bury this before it breathes," Sean muttered. "We have to be ready," Moore said. "Because if we're not—" A knock interrupted him. Moore rose to answer. A young woman stepped in, his paralegal Janelle Kim. She was short and poised, with straight black hair and a scar above one eyebrow she never explained. She passed him a sheet. "We just pulled Concannon's phone records." Moore scanned it. His eyes narrowed. One call, 5 minutes before the fire, to a landline registered under a Joseph Trent. "Who's that?" Amelia asked. Moore looked up, his face pale. "He's a licensed investigator. Used to work with Gable on insurance claims. But he also has a record of cleaning up problems. 2 years ago, a whistleblower linked him to witness intimidation in a separate case. It was dismissed for lack of evidence." "We need to find him," Sean said, already reaching for his coat. As the snow fell harder outside, the clock began ticking. Back at Ridgeway, Caleb sat on the floor of his small cell, Ranger resting beside him. The dog had not left his side since their reunion. Caleb's fingers absently stroked the patch of fur near Ranger's ear, where a scar curled like a comma. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. Ranger's breathing was steady, safe. The guard that brought lunch that day, Officer Lyle Bernard, paused a moment longer than usual. Bernard was a heavy-set man with a soft face and kind eyes, one of the few staff who never looked at Caleb with pity or suspicion. "Heard something about your transfer getting delayed," he said, setting down the tray. "Keep your chin up, kid." Caleb didn't respond, but when the man left, his hands trembled. That night, Ranger pressed his nose to Caleb's neck and whined softly. Somewhere out there, people were fighting for him. The sky above Detroit was pale gray, the kind of winter morning that seemed undecided between snow and rain. Ice rimmed the courthouse steps, crunching beneath the hurried feet of reporters, attorneys, and spectators. Inside, the air pulsed with anticipation. The emergency hearing had drawn more than just legal staff. Word of the reopened case had stirred the public's conscience, and the gallery swelled with silent tension. Caleb Morgan sat at the defendant's table, his small frame swallowed by the navy blazer Amelia had brought him. He was 13, but looked younger, gaunt, from 2 years of institutional food and the emotional cold of confinement. His tightly curled hair had grown longer, falling slightly over one eye. He didn't fidget. He didn't look around. Only when Ranger sat obediently by his side, pressed against his leg, did Caleb allow himself to breathe. Ranger, now almost 6 years old, had filled out with strength since his last public appearance. The German shepherd sat tall and alert, his sable fur brushed and eyes sharply focused. His ears twitched with every sound in the room, but his attention rarely strayed from Caleb. That bond forged in innocence and shattered by injustice had not broken. At the prosecutor's bench, Brian Moore looked every bit the part of a man facing judgment, not only from the court, but from himself. His crisp gray suit hung slightly loose at the shoulders, dark circles betraying long nights spent combing through legal archives. Yet in his face there was resolve the kind born of confronting one's own mistakes. Judge Eleanor Vance presided, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair cut short and deliberate. She had served on the bench for over 3 decades. Her voice was even her posture regal, and her reputation unshakably fair. With wire-rimmed glasses perched low on her nose, she surveyed the room. "Mr. Moore," she said, her voice firm but curious, "you've requested this emergency hearing on the basis of new evidence. Proceed." Brian stepped forward, holding a stack of documents. "Your Honor, the original case against Caleb Morgan was built on circumstantial evidence, a box of matches, and his presence at the scene. But we now have surveillance footage showing another man, identified as Thomas Concannon, near the property moments before the fire. This man had financial motives, a criminal history, and ties to the victim. Additionally, physical evidence at the scene, including forced entry from the rear of the property and an unidentified shoe print, was not previously accounted for in the trial." He took a breath. "After reviewing this new material, I cannot in good conscience uphold the validity of Caleb's original conviction. I am formally recommending that the charges be dropped and that Caleb Morgan be released immediately." A murmur spread across the courtroom. Caleb's heart thudded like a war drum in his chest. He turned slightly toward Amelia, who sat behind him, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap, knuckles white with tension. Beside her, Sean Holloway gave a subtle nod, his lined face unreadable. Judge Vance leaned back, arms crossed. "Do you have an affidavit from the original prosecutor, Mr. Hines?" Moore's lips thinned. Mr. Hines declined to comment, but has not filed an objection. The judge was silent for a long moment. Then she turned to Caleb. "Young man, is there anything you wish to say to this court?" Caleb stood slowly, unsure. His voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "I didn't set that fire. I just wanted to save the cat. I didn't want anyone to get hurt." He paused, eyes flicking down to Ranger. "But they took him from me. And then, they took everything else too." His voice cracked at the last word. A silence hung in the air like snow suspended in wind. Judge Vance looked to the bailiff. "Please read the court's decision into record." The bailiff, a tall man with a weathered face and a surprisingly gentle voice, stood. "By order of the court, the charges against Caleb Morgan are hereby dismissed. The minor is to be released into the care of Ms. Amelia Harper, pending formal expungement proceedings." The words echoed like bells in a cathedral. Before anyone could speak, a sudden bark shattered the silence. Ranger leapt to his feet and barked again, loud, clear, and filled with something like joy. The courtroom, frozen a heartbeat ago, dissolved into a wave of gasps and tears. Even Judge Vance's eyes shimmered behind her glasses. Caleb fell to his knees beside Ranger, burying his face in the thick fur of the shepherd's neck. The boy who had not cried in 2 years wept openly now, and no one told him to stop. Outside the courthouse, the snow had begun again, slow and delicate, as if nature itself had decided to reset the story. The sun broke gently over the Detroit River, laying golden threads across the rippling water and warming the frost-kissed edges of the riverside path. It had been 2 weeks since Caleb walked out of that courtroom, a free boy, and yet every morning he woke with the same jolt of disbelief until Ranger's warm breath and nudge of a damp nose reminded him it was real. The house he now called home belonged to Amelia Harper, the tall, willowy woman who had been his middle school English teacher, and the only adult who had ever looked at him and seen a child instead of a case file. Her house was old but full of life plants crowding windowsills, creaky floorboards that sang underfoot, and the smell of cinnamon that always seemed to linger even when she wasn't baking. Amelia, now in her early 40s, had a kindness that didn't dull her strength. She wore her long auburn hair in a loose bun, her eyes framed by faint lines from years of squinting at books and children's hearts alike. Her past, marked by the sudden death of her younger brother in juvenile detention, had left her with a quiet fury at systems that broke what they should heal. Caleb was learning how to exist without suspicion. No guards, no cameras, no locked doors. Some things were still hard, like sleeping through the night or trusting silence not to be a prelude to chaos. But Ranger's steady presence helped. The 6-year-old German shepherd was now his shadow, once again following him from room to room, resting his head on Caleb's knee whenever he sensed the storm brewing behind those thoughtful eyes. One morning, as the air softened with spring's first promise, Caleb stood on the porch holding a letter. It was addressed to the Detroit Center for Youth Justice. The envelope was simple, but inside it held the idea that had rooted itself in his chest ever since he'd watched other boys cry behind barred windows. Boys no older than him, but with no Amelia, no Ranger, and no lucky break. He found Amelia in the kitchen, humming quietly as she poured coffee. "Hey," he said, offering the letter. "Would you help me send this?" She took it, scanned the first few lines, then looked at him. "You're serious?" "I am," Caleb said. "I want to start something. Something that helps kids like me. The ones who didn't get a second look. Maybe we could call it the Second Light Project." Amelia's smile was slow and proud. "That's beautiful, Caleb. That's exactly what the world needs." Later that day, the two of them walked to the local community center with Ranger in tow. There they met Mrs. Tilda Carrington, a retired public defender in her 70s with cropped silver hair and thick glasses that never quite stayed on her nose. She had fought too many cases like Caleb's and lost sleep over too many verdicts that didn't sit right. Tilda read the letter in silence, then looked up, her voice gravelly but soft. "You're not waiting for the system to fix itself. You're going to become the reason it changes. I'm in." Over the next few weeks, Caleb's world grew wider. He gave his first interview, nervous, stammering at first, but then strong as he sat beside Ranger and Amelia on a local talk show. Donations began to arrive, small bills, handwritten notes of encouragement, even a painting from a 10-year-old girl in Iowa, of a boy and a dog under a star-filled sky. Caleb posted it on the wall of the community center office they were loaned. Despite the new beginning, Caleb never forgot the others. He spent afternoons writing letters to boys he had met inside, offering hope, offering to listen. Ranger, sensing the heaviness, would curl at his feet, licking the air gently whenever Caleb paused too long in silence. One particular afternoon, a boy named Jalen was released early, thanks to the work of the Second Light team. Caleb and Amelia went to meet him. Jalen was 15 taller than Caleb, wiry, with watchful eyes and a deep voice that rarely rose above a murmur. They shook hands like strangers at first. But when Jalen saw Ranger, his tough shell cracked. He smiled, crouched, and whispered something only the dog could hear. Caleb watched and nodded. He recognized that look. He had worn it once, too. By late spring, they had organized their first workshop, Voices Unheard, where former juvenile inmates shared their stories. Amelia gave the opening speech. Caleb closed the event with quiet strength. Ranger sat at his side, a symbol now of loyalty, of truth, and of second chances. That evening, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the three of them walked the river path again. Amelia wore a long scarf that caught the breeze like a banner. Caleb walked slowly, one hand resting on Ranger's back. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The river glimmered in gold and amber, and the birds overhead sang without hesitation. A new day had come. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Caleb wasn't just a boy cleared of false charges. He was now a guide, a builder, a quiet storm carving change in a landscape too long frozen. And beside him, the dog who never stopped believing. Sometimes doing what's right isn't the easiest path. A black boy falsely accused a loyal dog who never left his side, and a few brave souls who chose to believe in goodness when the world turned away. Caleb and Ranger's story reminds us that truth can be buried, but it never disappears. In everyday life, you may have met someone who just needed to be heard, a glance that simply needed to be trusted. Don't rush to judge. Don't look away. Because even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's life forever. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need a little faith in the goodness of the world. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next heartwarming story.